Hey guys, Mulligan here, and welcome to the next part of my Omens of the Past card review. We're finally tackling the multi-factions, and we're starting off with Praxis today. As I said before, since there are less multi-faction cards than single-faction ones in this set, the remaining videos should be shorter. Before we get started, for those that didn't watch my preview videos, I will only be talking about the cards as far as viability for ranked play. If the card isn't viable for ranked play at all, then I will try to touch on its draft viability. Also, I won't be talking about the banners, since even though you couldn't get them out of empty throne packs, they were still part of the previous metagame as set 0 cards. You just had to craft them. Let's get into it. So first up is Alluring Ember. A 1 power 1/1 unit requiring 2 fire and 2 time influence to play. It has flying, charge, and warp. One of the weirdest 1-drops in the game. The biggest hurdle for this card is the influence requirement. There's no way to play this on turn 1 currently, but it might be possible when future sets come out. This will come out on turn 2 at best, and despite having all these keywords making this unit as fast as it is, it becomes far less impactful every turn. Even starting from turn 2, when decks in Praxis colors would rather be doing something else, like setting up a Friendly Wisp or Rakano Outlaw, or maybe using Find the Way to search for power. I'd even rather set up a Sauropod Wrangler than play this turn 2, and then it just gets worse every turn from there. In Warp decks, this gets better, but I still don't think a 0-cost 1/1 charger is quite good enough for this to get a slot, assuming you have Workshop Forge in play. In draft, the story isn't much better, for mainly the same reasons I stated for constructed viability. And next up we have Noble Firemane, a 2 power 2/2 unit requiring 1 fire and 1 time influence to play. You can pay 5 to give your units +1/+1 this turn. I've seen people mess around with this card in their Praxis decks, Praxis tokens in particular. As an early game unit, the 2/2 stat line is a bit underwhelming because a 2/2 doesn't block or attack well without a battle skill that helps it in combat. Now, this is a unit you play for the buff ability, not the stats, so you'd want to protect this from damage anyway. But it would have still been nice if this had another point of health. The ability is not something you would use on turn 5. It's more of a super late game power sink when you are turn 7 and beyond, I feel. I think it's fringe at best as far as constructed is concerned. I could end up being wrong though, as I haven't personally tested the card yet. Next is Champion of Impulse, a 3 power 2/2 unit requiring 1 time and 1 fire influence to play. If you have 3 fire influence, when Champion of Impulse attacks, you gain +1 power this turn. If you have 3 time influence, she gets +2/+2. I looked at this card in my first preview video, but I have a bit more to say on it. Ideally, you want to meet both requirements by turn 4, when she'll be attacking, which is difficult but doable. This card turned out to be even better than I thought after seeing people play it in Praxis midrange. A 4/4 for 3 power is no joke, and ramping into the marquee card for Praxis midrange, Heart of the Vault, is insane on turn 5. Even ramping to 5 power on turn 4 is pretty good, since you're running stuff like Obliterate and Shatter Mage, if you don't have Sandstorm Titan in hand. Speaking of which, she is outmatched by stuff like Sandstorm Titan and Steward of the Past, but so is nearly every other popular 3-drop in constructed, to be honest. As expected, Praxis tokens hasn't touched this at all. A solid unit in constructed, and solid in draft, if you're in Praxis. Next card is Journeyman Armorer, a 3 power 2/2 unit requiring 1 fire and 1 time influence to play. He has warp, and when he comes into play, you play a +1/+1 weapon on another one of your units. So do you remember when I talked about Sparring Partner in my Justice review? Yeah. The art on this used to belong to a previous version of Sparring Partner in closed beta, that was the best 1-cost fire unit in the game, in my opinion. Turns out making a 5/3 on turn 2 with Ornate Katana is pretty busted. Anyway. Initially, this saw play in warp decks early on, but the hype for those decks has died down since. It's a bit too weak to see use anywhere else in Constructed, since you have to warp this in at a discount for this to be truly worth it, in my opinion. You'd much rather be playing Champion of Impulse otherwise. In Draft, though, this thing is an all-star in Praxis. An excellent 3-drop that I'm never sad picking up. Next, we have Purify, a 3-power fast spell requiring 1 fire and 1 time influence to play. You silence a unit and deal 3 damage to it. I personally thought people were highly overrating this card because a lot of players were really gushing over this when the set first came out. However, the hype has died down, and you don't see Purify in a lot of Praxis decks. And Praxis midrange is still the most popular deck at the time of this recording. It's great to silence a unit before killing it, but the problem with this card is that in most matchups, silencing a unit before killing it doesn't matter, because when they die from the 3 damage, they won't come back anyway. So the silence is wasted, and you paid 3 power for a torch effect. The only matchups where this would matter are against decks that abuse units in the void. Basically Reanimator decks like Haunting Scream and or stuff that with Vara and Whispers in the Void, and decks that play Dawnwalker. This can be great in the Praxis Mirror, however. The card is good, but not that good in Constructed. In Draft, though, this card is amazing because good removal comes at a premium, and this card, it definitely fits the bill. Next up, we have Brilliant Discovery, a 4-power spell requiring 1 fire and 1 time influence to play. It has Warp. You draw a fire sigil and a time sigil from your deck. I love the art on this card. The effect, not so much. It sucks that this has time requirements, which leads to the many problems this card faces. Since you're in time, your best turn 4 will almost always be Sandstorm Titan, not searching for more power when you should have been doing that turns 1 and 2. I wish this put the sigils in play as well. If it did, players would consider it for their decks, but as is, I seriously doubt this is viable and Constructed. I'd play Purify over this, and you already know how I feel about that card. The do-nothing nature of this card also means that this isn't playable in Draft either, a format that is unit-focused. And next we have Clever Stranger, a 4-power 2/2 unit requiring 1 fire and 1 time influence to play. He has Warp. While this is in play, Strangers have Warp. This could potentially be responsible for some insane board flood in a Stranger-heavy deck, if you can protect it. That's going to be tough to do since the only removal spells this dodges are Vanquish and Annihilate. There's not much else to say, as an all-in Stranger deck is the only thing this would see play in, and that deck has never really been viable at any point, but we'll see if Omens changes that in the future. Next we have Diogo Malaga, a 4-power 3/5 unit requiring 2 fire, influence, and 1 time influence to play. He has Charge and an ultimate where you pay 8 to give Diogo and each unit in your deck double damage and charge. This is part of a cycle of multi-faction legendaries units in this set that have high cost ultimates you can use as a power sink. I am still excited for this card, but I have some skepticism regarding it since the set has released, and it hasn't seen much play so far. The stat line, despite it not exactly benefiting charge, since you generally want a high strength stat in your charge units, is still pretty good overall. I think you will get to 8 power often enough to proc it in something like Praxis midrange, but there are issues with that. One is that the payoff is not immediate, and you'd need to draw some decently sized units afterwards to get full value from the ultimate. The other is that the effect kind of reminds me of a much slower Soulfire Drake. And if you think about the fact that the only cost to get charge units out of Soulfire Drake is for it to die, wouldn't you rather be playing that instead? Anyway, I'm actually hoping that this could be a thing, not just in Praxis midrange, but in Firetime Primal midrange as well. Of course, there would have to be a good reason to go 3 colors, but I like the possibility. I would be really sad if this card got skipped over and constructed. It's still one of my favorite cards in this set. Hearthstone has ETC, we've got this guy. Next we have Shatterglass Mage, a 5 power 5/3 unit requiring 1 fire and 1 time influence to play. She has Overwhelm and Warp, and when she comes into play, you kill an enemy attachment. This was the very first Warp card I looked at in my second preview video for this set. I'll try to be brief on this one, but I will say that this turned out to be better in Praxis midrange than I expected. I said this would compete with Twin Brute Sauropod, but that card hasn't seen play in the deck at all. Now, we are still in the honeymoon phase with this set as of the time of this recording, so we'll see if she sticks in that deck down the road. Sauropod may end up being better depending on how the meta shifts. Divining Rod decks were briefly messed with that ran this card, but have disappeared since. I'm also glad Direwolf fixed the typo in the word attachment as well after they spoiled this card a few weeks back. Spelling is hard sometimes. Next is Talir's Choice, a 5 power spell requiring 1 fire and 1 time influence to play. You can either deal 2 damage to the enemy player and your units get +2 strength this turn, or you can gain 2 health and play 2 1/1 explorers. The second worst choice card of the 5 in my opinion. I have lost to this card in ranked, much to my embarrassment, but I will explain why this is still bad. Let's say you play Praxis tokens and you want as many board-wide buff effects as possible. That deck could play up to 16 between this, Rally, Xenon Obelisk, and Arcana Monitor. For token generation, there's also Assembly Line. The biggest issue with this is the cost and that it's not a fast spell, unlike Rally. Getting a Kayla's Favor plus a weaker Rally effect is often not good enough for 5 and still requires you to have a decent board to take advantage of it. Gaining 2 health and getting a weaker Assembly Line is also not good enough for 5. I'd much rather burn something for 6 with Obliterate, or play Arcana Monitor on turn 5. Rally, Xenon Obelisk, Assembly Line, and Arcana Monitor are plenty. You don't need this card in your constructed deck. I even think it's underpowered in draft, but I could be wrong. It could be okay depending on the makeup of your deck. The next card is Workshop Forge, a 5 power relic requiring 1 fire and 1 time influence to play. It has Warp, and while this is in play, Warp cards on top of your deck cost 2 less. The crux of many Warp decks we saw early on. I don't think you can play Warp without this card, to be honest. But the deck has largely disappeared since then, which is unfortunate because it's a fun deck. It's just not necessarily good since a lot of Warp cards are so underpowered, and the discount this brings doesn't exactly make them better. Taking turn 5 off to drop this down isn't exactly a good thing either. You still need this to play a dedicated Warp deck, but it isn't viable in any other constructed deck as far as I can tell. Next we have Heart of the Vault, a 6 power 6/6 unit requiring 3 fire and 3 time influence to play. It has Warp. When it comes into play, you deal 2 damage to an enemy, you draw a card, and you reduce its cost by 2. The heart of every Praxis deck that has come out of Omens of the Past so far. It's so intriguing because this card is incredibly strong. but still feels fair. It doesn't do anything overpowered. It's just a good, solid mid-range 6-drop. This is the best Praxis mid-range has to offer, although that personally leaves me a bit concerned about the future of the archetype, but that is for another video on another day. Great card and constructed, and will very likely continue to be a core card if you're thinking about building Praxis mid-range. Next we have Sandglass Sentinel, a 7-power 3/6 unit requiring 1 fire and 1 time influence to play. It has Overwhelm. When you play a spell, Sandglass Sentinel gets +3 strength this turn. I was originally intrigued by this card for constructed, but my interest has faded the past few weeks. 7-drops that you have to babysit aren't appealing at all. You'd have to consistently be able to keep this at a 6/6 when your turn rolls around. Praxis has good spells worth playing, but not that many worth playing. This isn't even a consideration in any other type of deck using Praxis. In draft, it's been very disappointing the few times I did try it, which makes sense since the format is even less about spells than constructed is. And finally, we have Moment of Creation, an 8-power spell requiring 2 fire and 2 time influence to play. You play 2 Sentinels with strength and health equal to the number of spells in your void. I looked at this card in my 3rd preview video for this set. People didn't have high hopes for the card, and I took a wait and see approach on this since we didn't know all the cards in the set at the time. Now that we do, I think it's even less likely to see constructed play. I don't know if players are willing to play enough spells and fire in time to make this worth it. Some are staples in decks like Torch and Find the Way, but there are so many fringe spells the colors have access to as well, like Ancient Lore, Teleport, and Slow. The tokens really needed Overwhelm, I feel, in order for this card to be considered. It just isn't viable in my opinion, but I'll keep my eye on it. There might be a brew that no one has come up with that's actually good for ranked play. And that's it for the Praxis cards. For those that stuck around to the end, thanks so much for listening to my thoughts on them. Hopefully you enjoyed the content. If you did, feel free to like the video. If you want to check out more, feel free to look around my channel. I have a few Eternal series that I do, such as Eternal Heirs, which will be back this Friday. So I'm excited. It's a pretty good resource if you want to avoid the misplays I make with certain decks. And there's no actual deck text here yet, but sometimes I do videos discussing what I've learned playing certain decks, usually after spending time with the deck for several seasons. There's plenty of other Eternal content as well, so if you don't want to miss future videos, consider subscribing to the channel as well. Anyway, thanks again for taking time out of your day to watch this, and I'll see you all soon. Take care.